When Derek slid the deed to a rotting cabin across his mahogany desk, demanding I leave the horse ranch, I bled for these past 4 years. I just smiled and signed it. Outside, the prize stallions I had hand-reared were grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun. His face was so smug, so entirely sure he had just legally tossed a useless parasite out into the dirt. He poured himself a celebratory scotch, completely unaware that my simple signature was the exact blade that would sever the throat of his entire empire. The sun rises over the Colorado plains, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of pale gold and bruised purple. It is a breathtaking picture of wealth and untamed beauty. At the center of this sprawling valley sits the Silver Creek Ranch. To the outside world, this estate is a monument to one man's relentless ambition, Derek. Just last month, his perfectly manicured face graced the cover of Western Business Weekly. The headline read, "Emperor of the Plains." In the glossy photos, Derek stands tall against a pristine white fence, wearing custom leather boots that have never touched fresh mud. He smiles that winning, blinding smile, taking full credit for the thriving empire of purebred horses standing behind him. He shakes hands with wealthy investors. He signs the lucrative commercial deals. Every single legal document, every deed to the rolling pastures, every bank account linked to the estate bears only one name, his. He is the undisputed lord of the manor. And Elena, his wife of 4 years, is completely invisible. While Derek sleeps peacefully until the sun fully clears the eastern ridge, Elena's alarm goes off at 4 in the morning. And the November air inside the unheated farmhouse hallway is violently cold. She doesn't hesitate. She pulls on her worn, scuffed work boots and a heavy flannel jacket. She walks out into the biting wind, heading straight for the lower barns. This has been her reality, day after grinding day. She steps into the freezing mud. She grabs a heavy pitchfork and begins mucking out the stalls of the pregnant mares. The smell of raw earth, sweet hay, and animal sweat fills her lungs. Her hands are deeply calloused and scarred, her fingernails perpetually stained with dirt. She hauls heavy buckets of feed, checks the automatic waterers, and meticulously updates the complex breeding logs. She tracks the genetic lines, the feeding schedules, the exact temperament of every single foal born on that property. She is the silent, beating engine keeping this entire operation alive. She works with the brutal efficiency of 5 hired hands. Yet, according to the county clerk's office, she owns absolutely nothing. By 8 o'clock, the horses are fed, the barns are swept, and the breeding charts are updated. Elena walks back into the kitchen, washing the grime from her hands at the stainless steel sink. Derek finally emerges from the master suite. He smells of expensive sandalwood cologne and freshly pressed cotton. He walks right past her without a second glance, his eyes glued to the glowing screen of his smartphone. He types rapidly. A slow, deeply satisfied smirk creeps across his face. It is the exact same smirk he wears when he secures a massive payout, or when he receives a text from Victoria. Adelena sets a steaming mug of black coffee on the granite counter right next to his hand. He picks it up, still staring intensely at his screen. "Are the northern pastures cleared for the auction setup?" Derek asks, not bothering to look up. "Yes," Elena replies, her voice perfectly steady and flat. "The tents arrive tomorrow morning." Derek hums in lazy approval. He doesn't notice the chilling lack of warmth in her voice. He doesn't notice the way her eyes track the subtle tilt of his phone screen. He just assumes she is doing exactly what she was built to do, serve. Many would watch Elena silently clearing the breakfast plates, watching her husband text another woman, and mistake her absolute obedience for a flawless performance, or perhaps sheer cowardice. But human psychology dictates a much darker reality. This is not submission. This is a survival mechanism known as emotional detachment, when a human being faces a massive, catastrophic trauma of betrayal, and there is absolutely no immediate way out. The brain takes over. 4 years ago, Elena had no money, no property in her name, and no escape route, so her brain simply froze its emotional receptors. It shut down the pain to prioritize pure, calculated survival. Derek, drunk on his own towering arrogance, looks at her quiet, undemanding nature and sees the ultimate surrender of a weak, dependent woman. He doesn't understand the most basic rule of a breaking heart. A woman who cries, a woman who throws porcelain plates against the wall and screams in wild, burning jealousy, is a woman who still holds on to a shred of hope. She still cares enough to fight. She still desperately wants to salvage the burning wreckage of her marriage. But when she stops crying, when she stands in a sterile kitchen, methodically ironing his expensive shirts in absolute suffocating silence, when she mechanically shovels manure in the freezing cold and calmly watches him text his mistress without a single flinch, without a single tear, that is the exact moment hope is entirely eradicated. She has transitioned. She is no longer the wounded, bleeding wife. She has become the strategic, silent observer. The profound calmness radiating from Elena is not apathy. It is not forgiveness. She had simply finished all her crying years ago, alone in the dark corners of the Foaling barn. The absolute highest peak of human despair is never a loud, chaotic scream. It is a bone-chilling, methodical calmness. It is the quiet, daily preparation for the exact moment she will finally walk away, leaving nothing but ashes behind. 4 years ago, the illusion shattered. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The first frost had just hardened the ground. Derek was supposed to be in Denver for a week-long agricultural summit. He had kissed her cheek that morning, smelling of peppermint and deceit, and drove off in his black SUV. Elena was in the house doing what she always did, cleaning, organizing, surviving. She walked into his home office to dust the mahogany bookshelves. Derek strictly forbade her from touching his oak desk, but that day, a flashing light caught her eye. He had forgotten his backup tablet. It was tucked under a pile of leather-bound horse catalogs, buzzing relentlessly. Elena didn't usually pry. For the entirety of their relationship, she trusted him completely, but the buzzing wouldn't stop. She reached over and tapped the screen. A message popped up. It was from a contact saved simply as V. Can't wait for tonight. Leave the farm girl in the mud where she belongs. Elena froze. Her breathing stopped. Her thumb hovered over the glowing glass. With a trembling hand, she unlocked the device. He had used their wedding anniversary as the passcode. How violently ironic. She opened the messaging app. Hundreds of texts, thousands of photos. V was Victoria. Victoria wasn't just some random woman at a hotel bar. She was the sole heiress to the largest commercial real estate empire in the state. The messages were a sickening mix of cheap romance and ruthless mockery. Derek laughed at Elena's calloused hands, and he made jokes about how she smelled like hay and sweat while he drank champagne in downtown penthouses. A sharp, physical pain shot through Elena's chest. Her knees buckled slightly, hitting the edge of the heavy oak desk. She gripped the wood, her knuckles turning bone white. She thought the infidelity was the deepest wound a husband could inflict. She was wrong. The second stab was waiting in his email outbox. Her eyes caught a subject line that made her blood run entirely cold. Project Silver Creek Resort. Final draft. She opened the attached document. It was a topographical map of the ranch, but it wasn't just any ranch. This was the exact soil her grandfather had bled for. This was the land she had grown up on. 3 years prior, when the estate taxes threatened to bankrupt her family, when Derek had played the role of the ultimate savior, he paid the debts, but he convinced Elena that, for tax purposes and liability protection, the deed needed to be transferred entirely into his name. I will protect your legacy, Elena. Trust me, those were his exact words. She had signed the papers with tears of immense gratitude in her eyes. Now, staring at the screen, the horrific truth stared back at her. The map showed the lower pastures, the very place she buried her childhood dog, marked for demolition. The historic Foaling barns were crossed out, replaced by blueprints for a luxury spa and a boutique hotel. Derek wasn't just sleeping with Victoria. He was selling Elena's ancestral home to Victoria's corporate conglomerate. He was going to bulldoze her bloodline for a massive multi-million-dollar payout. And the email thread detailed the timeline. Derek assured Victoria's father that he would secure the final zoning permits within a few years. And then, he wrote, "I'll drop the dead weight and we break ground." The dead weight. That was her. That was the sum total of her existence in his eyes. Elena didn't scream. She didn't throw the tablet against the stone fireplace. She didn't call him and demand an explanation. She stood in the dead silence of that vast, empty house. The wind howled against the window panes. Her hands stopped shaking. The agonizing heat in her chest rapidly cooled into a block of solid, absolute ice. She carefully closed the email. She marked the messages as unread. She wiped her fingerprints off the glass screen with the hem of her flannel shirt, placing the tablet back exactly where she found it, precisely half an inch from the edge of the catalog. She walked out of the office and gently closed the door. She walked all the way down to the stables. She picked up her pitchfork, and she went back to work. Derek thought he had successfully manipulated a naive, uneducated farm girl. He thought she would eventually leave with nothing but a broken heart and the clothes on her back. He had no idea that in the span of 20 minutes he had murdered the gentle woman who loved him and birthed the exact architect of his upcoming ruin. From that Tuesday onward, every meal she cooked for him, every shirt she ironed, every quiet nod of her head was a calculated lie. She needed time. She needed a flawless strategy, and she was going to use his towering arrogance as her ultimate weapon. When it took 30 days of bleeding fingers and strained eyes, Elena sat in the dusty tack room every single night under a single flickering bulb, working the thick leather with a heavy steel needle. It was a custom Western saddle, hand-tooled with intricate oak leaves and the proud silver crest of the ranch. She made it for his 40th birthday, a peace offering, a quiet, desperate attempt to bridge the massive, freezing canyon growing between them. She rubbed the leather with oil until it gleamed like dark honey, wiping the sweat from her forehead with a dirt-stained sleeve. The evening of his birthday finally arrived. The winter wind was howling violently against the heavy wooden barn doors. Derek walked in wearing a tailored charcoal suit and a crisp white shirt. He smelled of expensive scotch and that familiar, sickening peppermint. When he was holding his phone, his thumb swiping rapidly across the glowing screen, Elena stood by the main stallion stall, holding the heavy saddle in both hands. "Happy birthday, Derek." He stopped. He looked at the beautifully crafted leather, then down at his heavy gold wristwatch. "Thanks." "Put it with the others." He didn't touch it. He didn't even step 1 inch closer. "I made it for you," Elena said, her voice quiet, steady, hand-stitched, every piece. Derek sighed, a sharp sound of profound irritation. "I have a dinner in the city, Elena. Real estate investors, highly important people. I don't have time to play cowgirl in the dirt right now." He reached out, grabbed the horn of the saddle, and carelessly tossed it aside. It hit the dirt floor with a dull, heavy thud. A thick cloud of dust rose around the polished, oiled leather. "Don't wait up," he said. He turned on his heel and walked out. The heavy barn door slammed shut. The engine of his luxury SUV roared to life and quickly faded down the long gravel driveway. Elena stood perfectly still in the freezing air. The cold draft seeped entirely through her thin jacket. She looked down at the saddle in the dirt. It was a masterpiece of brutal labor and craftsmanship, discarded like absolute trash, just like her. She didn't drop to her knees. She didn't shed a single tear. She walked over, picked up the heavy leather, and methodically wiped the dust away with her sleeve. She placed it carefully on a wooden display rack. Then she walked directly to the rusted steel filing cabinet in the dark corner of the tack room. She pulled open the squeaky bottom drawer. From beneath a pile of old, yellowed veterinary receipts, she took out a thick, battered leather journal. It was the official horse pedigree log. The cover was stained with axle grease and years of age. To anyone else, it was just a tedious, mind-numbing record of breeding dates, vaccination schedules, and genetic lines. The most boring book on the entire property. To Elena, it was the perfect vault. She carried the heavy book to the small wooden desk. She turned on the brass desk lamp. She opened the thick cover. The first 50 pages were exactly what they claimed to be. Endless handwritten records of mares and stallions. But she flipped past the middle section to the blank pages in the back. From inside her jacket, she pulled out a folded stack of crisp, white papers. She had spent the last 3 weeks quietly printing them from the main house computer while Derek slept soundly in the master bedroom. She took a glue stick from the top drawer. Carefully, methodically, she began pasting the printed documents over the blank pages. Page 84. A bank statement from a hidden offshore account. Page 85. The wire transfer receipt for massive, unexplained sums of money sent directly to Victoria's private holding company. Page 86. The drafted zoning permits for the luxury resort, complete with Derek's forged signature over her family's historic land rights. She smoothed the paper down with the palm of her hand, ensuring there were absolutely no wrinkles. Her hands were perfectly steady. Her breathing was slow, even, and entirely controlled. This became her permanent, nightly ritual. And every single morning she was the invisible, dirt-stained farmhand. She mucked the stalls in the freezing mud. She fed the horses. She served Derek his black coffee and silently washed his plates. But every night at 2 a.m, she was the silent architect of his upcoming destruction. She tracked every stolen dollar. She documented every secret meeting. She gathered the exact serial numbers of the shell companies he was using to bleed the ranch dry. She pasted them all into the old leather journal, sealing his fate between pages of horse bloodlines. Whenever Derek came into the barn, the book sat completely open on the desk. He never glanced at it twice. He despised the dirty, physical work of the ranch. He would never touch a grimy pedigree log. His towering arrogance was his absolute blind spot. And he was building a house of cards, and he had no idea his silent wife was quietly removing the foundation, piece by piece. Week 1 of her secret war brought a crushing, absolute realization. Elena took the copies of the forged deed to a free legal clinic in the next county over, parking her rusted truck 2 blocks away just to be safe. The exhausted public defender looked at the papers, sighed heavily, and gave her the brutal truth. The signatures were perfectly notarized. Derek's legal maneuver was entirely bulletproof. Contesting it in court would require a massive team of corporate attorneys and millions of dollars she simply did not have. She had exactly $42 to her name. The land was officially lost. It was an ironclad, inescapable trap. She drove back to the ranch as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks. The heater in the truck was broken. Her hands gripping the steering wheel were numb with cold. She parked behind the lower barn and sat in the dark, looking out at the sprawling, moonlit pastures. Derek had successfully stolen her grandfather's soil. He had won. She walked slowly through the quiet stables, the heavy scent of hay and dust filling her lungs. Suddenly, a deep, rhythmic breathing caught her attention. It was Midnight Sovereign, their prize stallion. He was worth over $500,000 on the open market. His offspring routinely sold for 6 figures. Elena stopped. She reached out, resting her hand on the stallion's warm, velvet neck. A sharp, sudden thought pierced completely through her despair. The land is just dirt. Dirt doesn't print money. The bloodlines do. Derek owned the grass. But who actually owned the genetic legacy grazing on top of it? That exact night, the real grueling work began. Elena didn't just need evidence of his infidelity. She needed an entirely new arsenal. She needed to understand the invisible, complex chains of corporate ownership. She started with the local public library. Every Wednesday afternoon, while Derek assumed she was running errands for the house, she sat hidden in the back aisles. She pulled heavy, dense volumes on commercial law, corporate structures, and intellectual property. When the librarian asked friendly questions, Elena just smiled softly and said she was taking a correspondence course. She smuggled the thick textbooks back to the tack room, burying them deep inside empty grain sacks. The winter of that second year was violently unforgiving. The temperatures plummeted far below zero. While Derek slept under thick, heated down blankets in the master suite, Elena sat in the freezing tack room. Her only source of warmth was a small, dangerous wire heater. She wore 3 layers of stiff thermal shirts, her breath misting thick and white in the freezing air. She read until her eyes physically burned. The legal jargon was a dense, impenetrable wall. Limited liability companies, tangible versus intangible asset transfers, intellectual property rights for agricultural and genetic assets. She read the exact same paragraphs 5, 10, 15 times until the spinning words finally locked into a clear picture. She learned that, in the state of Colorado, physical property attached to the land belonged to the deed holder, but intellectual property, specifically to patented genetic lines and exclusive breeding rights, could be legally isolated and held by a completely separate corporate entity. But understanding the law was only half the battle. She had to master the science to legally back it up. She had to prove, on paper, that she was the sole, undisputed architect of the entire breeding program. She used the spare cash she saved from selling leftover horseshoe iron to a local scrapper to order advanced veterinary science textbooks. She studied equine genetics, DNA sequencing, the precise heritability of traits. It was an agonizing physical grind that stripped her down to the bone. One night in late January, a young mare went into labor 3 weeks early. Elena was entirely alone on the property. Derek was in the city, his phone turned off, likely drinking champagne in a penthouse suite. Then the barn was freezing. The wind fiercely battered the thin wooden walls. Elena knelt in the blood and damp straw for 4 exhausting hours. She had to physically turn the struggling foal inside the birth canal, her arms coated in slick amniotic fluid, her muscles screaming in pure agony. When the foal finally took its first ragged breath, Elena collapsed against the wooden stall, exhausted, shivering violently in the dark. She didn't go to sleep. She wiped her shaking hands on a rough towel, walked straight back to the tack room, turned on the dim brass lamp, and continued studying the legal precedents for separating agricultural livestock from real estate. Her hands were covered in cracked, bleeding blisters. Her lower back ached with a constant dull fire. She lived entirely on 3 hours of sleep and bitter black coffee. When there were countless moments when the sheer, crushing weight of the exhaustion nearly broke her mind. She would stare at the complex legal codes, feeling a heavy, suffocating wave of defeat rising in her throat. But then, she would remember the discarded saddle in the dirt. She would remember the email, the dead weight. The exhaustion would instantly vanish, replaced by a cold, razor-sharp focus. By the end of the 3rd year, the quiet farm girl who didn't know the difference between a tort and a binding contract was completely gone. In her place sat a woman who understood the microscopic loopholes of corporate asset division better than a highly paid attorney. She realized she didn't need to fight Derek for the land at all. Let him keep the dirt. Let Victoria's corporate empire have the empty, worthless pastures. Elena was going to legally, quietly, and systematically extract the entire soul of the Silver Creek Ranch right out from under them. She was going to build an impenetrable fortress made entirely out of paper, and Derek was far too busy admiring his own reflection to notice the walls rising silently behind his back. 4 years is a long time to live inside a ghost story. Every single week, Derek threw away things he considered entirely worthless. Rusted horseshoes, broken leather bridles, empty feed barrels, and metric tons of rich compost. To an emperor, it was just offensive garbage. To a woman quietly digging her way out of a grave, it was untraceable capital. Every Thursday morning, while Derek was having 3 martini lunches with real estate developers in the city, Elena loaded the rusted flatbed truck. On her muscles ached as she hauled heavy scrap iron to a salvage yard at the far edge of the county. She sold premium organic compost to local, independent nurseries under a fake name. The buyers always paid in crumpled, dirty $20 bills. She didn't buy new clothes. She didn't buy hot coffee to fight the winter chill. Every single dollar, every stray coin, went directly into a heavy steel lockbox buried beneath a loose floorboard in the back of the tack room. Over 4 brutal years, those crumpled bills slowly turned into thousands of dollars. Clean, invisible cash. She used that hidden money to hire a registered corporate agent 3 states away. With a series of untraceable money orders sent from a distant post office, she formed an anonymous limited liability company in Delaware. She named it Iron Lineage Holdings. On public record, it was just a faceless corporate entity. In reality, it was her impenetrable legal fortress. Then came the absolute masterpiece of her silent war. Elena knew the commercial law now. She knew that real estate and agricultural intellectual property were 2 entirely separate, distinct domains. Derek owned the dirt. He owned the white wooden fences, the massive steel tractors, and the luxury barns. But the horses, the 200 purebred stallions and mares that made the ranch worth millions, they were a completely different story. Their true value wasn't in their hooves, it was in their blood, their heavily guarded DNA. For decades, her family had meticulously cultivated these specific genetic lines. As the primary handler, medical caretaker, and farm manager, Elena was legally recognized by the National Registry as the breeder of record. During a chaotic routine tax season, she slipped a thick stack of registration transfer forms into Derek's massive pile of signature-required documents. Derek hated paperwork. He violently despised the mundane administrative details of the ranch. He sat at his sprawling mahogany desk, sipping an expensive glass of scotch, and rapidly scribbled his signature across 20 different pages without reading a single printed paragraph. With a few lazy strokes of his gold pen, Derek legally surrendered all breeding rights, genetic patents, and commercial registration of the entire herd to Iron Lineage Holdings, to Elena. The horses still stood on his land, but he no longer owned the legal right to sell them, breed them, or profit from a single one of their offspring. The grand empire was officially hollowed out from the inside. In the high-stakes world of corporate negotiations, there is a fundamental, unbreakable rule. It is called the BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. In any negotiation, the person with the absolute highest power is the person who has the best backup plan if the deal completely falls apart. Whoever can walk away unharmed wins the war. Derek was unbearably arrogant because he believed Elena's BATNA was exactly 0. He looked at her and saw a woman with no college degree, no independent income, and no property to her name. He truly believed that if he kicked her out, her only alternative was starving on the side of the road. He thought he could throw a miserable $100,000 at her, and she would drop to her knees in desperate, weeping gratitude. He was playing a high-stakes game of chess against a woman he thought didn't even know how to set up the board. But for 4 agonizing years, Elena had been quietly building a massive, towering BATNA right behind his back. She didn't just create a tiny safety net. She secured the exclusive, ironclad rights to a multi-million-dollar genetic legacy. When he handed her that insulting divorce agreement, his alternative to the deal was keeping a wealthy, functioning ranch. Her alternative was walking away with the entire soul of the business in her pocket. The cruelest truth of any partnership, whether in business or in marriage, is that you do not get what you deserve based on your silent, invisible sacrifices. You do not get what is fair just because you worked hard in the shadows while no one was looking. You only get exactly what you have the leverage to negotiate. Financial independence is the ultimate, undeniable weapon. Elena sat alone in the dark barn, watching Midnight Sovereign pace his large stall. She held the final stamped approval from the National Patent Office in her dirt-stained, calloused hands. Her heart beat with a slow, incredibly heavy rhythm. She folded the thick paper carefully and slipped it deep into her jacket pocket. She looked out at the sprawling acres of silver grass beyond the barn doors. Derek could keep his precious dirt. She was taking the gold. And the silent countdown to the auction had officially begun. The morning of the annual Silver Creek Elite auction was painfully cold. The sky was a pale, bruised gray. This was the most important day of the year for the Colorado Elite. Millions of dollars would change hands before sunset. It was the day Derek lived for. Inside the sprawling main house, the silence was absolutely deafening. It had been exactly 72 hours since Derek handed Elena the divorce papers and the deed to the rotting cabin. 72 hours since he looked her in the eye and told her she was entirely replaceable. He had braced himself for a hurricane. He expected shattered porcelain plates, hysterical crying, desperate bargaining. He had mentally prepared a dozen cruel, cutting speeches to shut her down, but the hurricane never came. Derek stood in the doorway of the laundry room, holding a mug of black coffee. He watched his wife. Elena stood over the ironing board. The heavy, heated iron glided smoothly across his custom charcoal vest. The sharp hiss of the steam filled the quiet, sterile room. She pressed the fabric with absolute mechanical precision. Her face was a blank, unreadable mask. She did not look like a woman whose entire world had just been completely destroyed. "There you are," Elena said, her voice perfectly level, completely devoid of emotion. "The vest is pressed. I checked the weather. You will want the heavier wool coat for the evening." Derek slowly lowered his coffee mug. He stared at her. He searched her face, desperately looking for a flicker of devastation, a swollen eyelid, a trembling lip. Nothing. Her eyes were as clear and cold as a frozen lake. "Thanks," Derek muttered, reaching out to take the vest from her hands. Their fingers brushed. Her skin was freezing, but her grip was entirely steady. She didn't pull away. She didn't linger. A strange, deeply unsettling sensation began to crawl up the back of Derek's neck. He was a man who thrived on dominance. He understood submission. He understood fear. But this flawless, silent efficiency, it felt entirely wrong. It felt incredibly dangerous. Elena moved past him and walked quietly into his mahogany study. She began packing the leather briefcases for the auction. She stacked the thick, bitter catalogs, the veterinary clearance forms, and the VIP guest lists. Her movements were sharp, precise, completely geometric. She didn't slam the heavy desk drawers. She didn't sigh heavily into the empty air. "Are the transport trailers ready?" Derek asked, his voice a little too loud, leaning against the doorframe, actively testing her. "Washed." Or hitched and idling by the lower gates, Elena answered immediately, not even bothering to look up from the leather case. "The drivers have their official manifests. The pregnant mares are already loaded. The stallions go in exactly 1 hour." She snapped the brass locks of the briefcase shut. The sharp click echoed loudly across the hardwood floor. Derek swallowed hard. The thick silence in the room was starting to physically suffocate him. "You are taking this remarkably well," he said, deliberately letting the cruel words hang in the air. Elena stopped. She finally looked up at him. Her gaze was completely hollow. "I am being practical, Derek. Tears won't change the paperwork." She picked up the heavy briefcases and walked straight out to the idling truck. Derek stood frozen, watching her from the large bay window, and his heart beat with a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. Why wasn't she fighting? Why wasn't she begging him for a better financial settlement? A farm worker with absolutely nothing to her name should be terrified of the streets. Instead, she was packing his bags like a loyal, unfeeling soldier. Through the frost-covered glass, he watched her walk across the gravel to the main barn. She stepped into the dim tack room. In the corner sat the custom, hand-tooled leather saddle she had made for his 40th birthday, the exact one he had thrown into the dirt 4 years ago. It had sat on a wooden display rack ever since, a silent, pathetic monument to her ultimate humiliation. Derek held his breath. He expected her to finally break down, to hug the heavy leather, to mourn the dead marriage, to finally show a single crack in her armor. And he watched closely, waiting for the tears. Elena did not hesitate. She picked up the heavy saddle. She didn't caress the intricate floral carvings. She grabbed a thick, dirty canvas tarp and wrapped it tightly around the leather. She took a length of rough nylon rope and tied it into a harsh, violent knot. Then she shoved the heavy bundle deep into a dark, forgotten storage locker and slammed the rusted metal door shut. It wasn't a moment of grief. It was a burial. Fast, efficient, and completely devoid of human emotion. Derek stepped back from the window. A drop of cold sweat finally broke on his forehead. He rubbed his chest, feeling a sudden, inexplicable tightness gripping his lungs. He had spent his entire life hunting. He knew exactly how wounded prey behaved. They panicked. They thrashed wildly. They made stupid and desperate mistakes. Prey did not perfectly iron your clothes. Prey did not calmly organize your financial documents. Prey did not quietly bury their past without a single tear. Only a predator did that. He looked down at the signed divorce papers still sitting perfectly aligned on his desk. He had won. He had the sprawling land. He had Victoria's corporate backing. He had the ultimate, absolute victory. So why did he suddenly feel like he was walking blindly into a steel trap? The antique grandfather clock in the hallway chimed loudly. It was time to leave for the auction. Derek put on the perfectly pressed charcoal vest. It fit flawlessly. But for the first time in his arrogant, entitled life, he felt entirely exposed. The storm wasn't over. The storm was just holding its breath. On the main event tent was a massive cathedral of white canvas and gleaming steel, erected right over the northern pastures. Crystal chandeliers hung directly above the central auction ring, casting a brilliant, blinding light over the freshly laid pine shavings. This was the Silver Creek Elite Auction. The air was thick with the smell of expensive cedar, imported cigars, and high-end perfume. Waiters in crisp black vests moved silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays filled with crystal champagne flutes. The wealthiest ranchers, corporate investors, and socialites in Colorado stood in small, exclusive circles. Millions of dollars were about to change hands before the sun fully set. Derek stepped onto the raised wooden podium. The bright spotlight hit him instantly. When the low hum of conversation across the massive tent fell completely silent, he stood tall, radiating absolute authority. He wore the custom charcoal vest, the exact piece of clothing Elena had flawlessly ironed just a few hours ago. He tapped the microphone twice. The sharp, metallic sound echoed across the silent crowd. "Welcome, my friends, to the dawn of a completely new era for Silver Creek." He smiled his signature, blinding smile. He gripped the edges of the podium, looking out over the sea of wealthy faces. For generations, this land has stood as a testament to the raw, untamed spirit of the West. But a true legacy does not survive by standing still. It survives by evolving. Tonight, before we begin the bidding on our magnificent yearlings, I have a profound announcement regarding the future of this estate. Derek turned his body slightly, gesturing with an open, elegant hand toward the VIP tables in the very front row. I am incredibly proud to announce a landmark strategic partnership with the pinnacle of luxury development. We are officially joining forces with Vanguard Estate Holdings. Victoria sat in the center seat of the front row. She wore a deep emerald silk gown, a heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. She crossed her legs, looking up at Derek with a sharp, predatory smile. She raised her champagne glass in a silent, victorious toast. We will be transforming the lower 400 acres into an exclusive, world-class equestrian resort. Derek continued, his voice booming through the speakers. A sanctuary where the elite can experience the majesty of the West, wrapped in uncompromising luxury. And the crowd erupted into enthusiastic applause. Investors nodded in deep approval. It was a ruthless, brilliant business move. Derek waited exactly 10 seconds, letting the applause wash over him, feeding his towering ego. Then he raised a single hand to quiet the room. The clapping slowly died down. Derek adjusted his posture. He lowered his head slightly, softening his expression. The arrogant businessman vanished, instantly replaced by a mask of manufactured, sorrowful humility. With great progress comes great personal transition, he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate timbre. Many of you know my wife, Elena. At the back of the tent, standing entirely in the shadows near the heavy canvas exit flaps, Elena stood perfectly still. She wore a simple dark wool coat. Her hands rested quietly at her sides. She held the old, battered leather pedigree log. Derek looked out at the audience, his eyes shining under the harsh stage lights. Elena and I have built something truly beautiful together. But recently, we've both come to the painful realization that our paths are diverging. We have decided to end our marriage. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Derek took a slow, calculated breath. Divorce is never easy, but I stand before you tonight to assure you that this parting is completely amicable. Elena has been the quiet backbone of this ranch, and because of that, I have personally ensured she is remarkably well taken care of. He looked directly toward the back of the tent, his eyes locking onto Elena's silhouette in the shadows. I have transferred an independent estate entirely into her name, along with a substantial financial settlement. When she will never have to worry about her future. I wanted to publicly honor her tonight and wish her absolute peace as she begins her new chapter. It was a flawless, terrifying performance. The independent estate was a rotting, abandoned cabin with a collapsing roof. The substantial financial settlement was a fraction of what he spent on a single luxury sports car. He was publicly slaughtering her, stripping her of her home, her livelihood, and her legacy, while demanding the world praise him for his unbelievable generosity. The audience bought every single word. The wealthy elite began to clap, first scattered, then rising into a roaring, thunderous wave of applause. They were not applauding her departure. They were applauding him. They admired his grace. They admired his noble, gentlemanly conduct. And women in the front rows looked at him with profound sympathy and deep respect. Victoria clapped the loudest, her eyes gleaming with absolute triumph. Derek stood at the podium, bathing in the deafening sound. He looked down at the crowd, a god among men. He had executed the perfect crime. He had stolen the land, secured the wealthy mistress, completely erased his wife, and was now being worshipped as a hero for doing it. In the shadows, Elena did not flinch. She did not lower her head in shame. She did not drop a single tear. She simply stood there, listening to the roaring applause. Her fingers slowly tightened around the thick, heavy binding of the leather book. The trap was fully set. The emperor had just finished building his own spectacular gallows, and the crowd was completely silent as the heavy canvas flaps shifted. And Elena began to walk slowly, deliberately, straight down the center aisle. The heavy canvas flaps fell shut behind her. Elena walked straight down the center aisle. The thick layer of fresh pine shavings absorbed the sound of her heavy work boots. The wealthy crowd parted silently, stepping back as if a ghost had just entered the grand cathedral. Up on the brilliantly lit podium, Derek's manufactured smile froze completely. The thunderous applause died instantly. The silence in the massive tent became thick, heavy, almost suffocating. He gripped the edge of the wooden podium. His knuckles turned bone white. He leaned into the microphone. "Elena," he said, his voice tight, slipping slightly from its smooth, practiced rhythm. "What are you doing? We already agreed." She didn't stop. She didn't look at him. And she climbed the 3 wooden steps to the stage. She walked directly to the podium. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stood next to the man who had just publicly erased her, and she gently pushed him aside. Derek stumbled back. The crowd gasped loudly. Victoria stood up in the front row, her emerald gown catching the light, her eyes narrowing in sudden anger. Elena ignored her entirely. She placed the old, grease-stained leather pedigree book right on top of Derek's glossy, expensive auction brochures. She adjusted the microphone with a steady hand. "Good evening," Elena said. Her voice rang out through the towering speakers, perfectly calm, entirely steady. Derek mentioned that we built something truly beautiful together. He mentioned a transition. He was right. But he forgot to clarify the exact terms of our arrangement to his new corporate investors. Derek stepped forward, his face flushing dark red. "Cut the microphone," he hissed at the sound technician in the back. "Get her off the stage." The technician didn't move a single muscle. The crowd was absolutely captivated. Nobody breathed. Elena opened the heavy leather cover of the journal. She didn't look at the crowd anymore. She looked directly at Victoria's father, the billionaire CEO of Vanguard Estate Holdings, sitting perfectly still in the front row. "You are buying 400 acres of prime Colorado real estate today," Elena said. "You are paying $50 million for the Silver Creek legacy, but there is a fundamental, catastrophic flaw in your due diligence." She turned the page. The crisp, white legal documents she had secretly pasted inside gleamed under the crystal chandeliers. In the state of Colorado, land and agricultural intellectual property are two distinctly separate legal assets, Elena continued. "My soon-to-be ex-husband owns the dirt under your expensive shoes. He owns the white wooden fences, the luxury barns, and the steel tractors. He has every legal right to sell you the empty pastures." Derek was sweating profusely. A thick bead of cold sweat rolled down his temple. His breathing became incredibly shallow, rapid, terrified. "Elena," he whispered, blind panic bleeding heavily into his voice. "What are you doing? Stop!" Elena turned another page. She pulled out a heavily stamped, notarized document and held it up to the blinding stage lights. "But the dirt does not generate revenue," Elena said, on her voice echoing like a final, absolute verdict. "The true value of Silver Creek lies entirely in the genetics of the 200 purebred horses standing in those barns right now. For decades, my family cultivated those specific bloodlines, and 4 years ago, Derek legally transferred all breeding rights, genetic patents, and exclusive commercial registrations to an independent, anonymous corporate entity." She turned her head and looked directly at Derek. Her eyes were completely empty. "That entity is Iron Lineage Holdings, LLC. I am the sole proprietor. I own the blood. I own the patents. I own every single horse on this property, and I own the exclusive legal right to every foal they will ever produce." The silence in the tent was absolute and terrifying. Victoria's father slowly took off his reading glasses, his face turning entirely pale. He realized instantly that he was about to buy a worthless, empty patch of grass. Victoria stared at Derek in sheer, unmasked horror. Derek opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His legs trembled violently. He reached out, grabbing the edge of the podium to stop himself from falling over. "No," he gasped, his chest heaving as if he were suffocating. "That's a lie. I never signed—" "You signed the transfer authorizations 4 years ago during tax season." "Derek," Elena said smoothly, cutting him off completely. "You didn't read them. They are filed, registered, and federally protected. You kept the empty house. I took the empire." She closed the leather book. The heavy thud echoed across the silent room like a gavel striking wood. "The land is yours to bulldoze," she said, looking back at the shocked investors. "But the horses are mine, and my transport fleet is idling at the lower gates right now. We move out at dawn. Enjoy the dirt, Derek." Derek let go of the podium. His knees buckled entirely. He collapsed onto the hard wooden stage floor, his tailored charcoal suit crumpling in a pathetic heap. The Emperor of the Plains sat trembling in the dust, staring up at the woman he had thrown away, finally realizing she had just buried him alive. The sun had not yet crested the jagged Colorado horizon. The air was violently cold, biting through fabric and skin, but the Silver Creek Ranch was already awake. The low, heavy rumble of 20 massive diesel engines shook the frozen ground. A fleet of state-of-the-art equine transport trucks sat idling in a perfectly organized line, stretching from the lower pastures all the way to the main county highway. Elena stood by the open steel gates, holding a heavy clipboard. She wore her scuffed work boots and the thick flannel jacket she had worn every single winter. She watched quietly as her hired handlers methodically led 200 purebred stallions, mares, and trembling foals up the metal ramps. There was no chaos, there was no shouting. It was a flawless surgical extraction. The lifeblood of the empire was simply walking away in the dark. Inside the sprawling main house, the heavy rumble vibrated through the imported floorboards. Derek bolted upright in his custom king-sized bed, his heart hammered wildly against his ribs. He threw off the heavy down blankets and sprinted to the large bay window. He dragged the velvet curtains aside. His breath hit sharply in his throat. The massive luxury barns were completely empty, and the stable doors swung violently in the freezing wind. He watched the red taillights of the final transport truck disappear down the long gravel driveway. He scrambled for his phone on the mahogany nightstand, his hands shaking so violently he dropped it twice on the hardwood floor. He dialed her number. The phone rang once, twice, then connected. "Elena!" he screamed, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. "You can't do this. Bring them back right now." Elena sat in the passenger seat of the lead truck. She watched the dark silhouette of the mountains roll past the window. She held the phone to her ear, listening to the frantic, ragged breathing of the man who had ordered her to leave with nothing just 3 days ago. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand an apology. She didn't feel the sudden, overwhelming urge to explain herself. "I am leaving the dirt exactly as you requested, Derek," she said. The line went dead. Elena calmly pulled the phone away from her ear. She pressed a single button on the glass screen, block contact. She placed the phone face down on her lap and looked back out at the open road. Derek stood in his empty bedroom, listening to the harsh, repetitive beep of a disconnected line. He dialed again, his fingers slipping blindly on the glass. Call failed. He dialed again. Call failed. He threw the phone violently against the stone fireplace, shattering it into a dozen jagged pieces. He collapsed onto the edge of the bed, burying his face in his trembling hands. He thought her blocking him was a rash, emotional mistake. He thought she was just being petty, punishing him in the heat of the moment. Many people would view a blocked number as a temporary tantrum, but Elena was not a petty woman. She was a corporate entity, and her actions were not driven by anger. They were driven by immaculate, calculated foresight. Exactly 5 minutes later, a sharp ping echoed from Derek's laptop across the room. An automated email had just arrived in his pristine, empty inbox. It was sent directly from the legal department of Iron Lineage Holdings. Derek walked slowly to the desk. He opened the message. It read, "Dear Mr. Derek, per the strict instructions of our Chief Executive Officer, all direct personal communication is hereby permanently severed. If you wish to discuss the leasing, purchasing, or genetic licensing of any asset owned by Iron Lineage Holdings, you will do so exclusively through our registered corporate portal. Any further attempts to contact our client on her personal mobile device or approach her physical person will be formally documented as corporate harassment and immediately forwarded to local authorities." He stared at the screen. The words blurred together. Blocking his number was not a dramatic exit. It was the installation of an impenetrable steel boundary. For 4 years, Derek had controlled her reality. He had used his charm, his anger, and his masterful manipulation to keep her small, compliant, and deeply confused. He had always relied on his ability to talk his way out of any consequence. But Elena had just stripped him of his absolute greatest weapon. She had taken away his audience. Legal communication is communication by text, backed by evidence, with absolutely no room for tears or empty promises. And from this exact moment forward, Derek was no longer a powerful husband demanding total obedience. He was simply a desperate, bankrupt man standing in an empty field, forced to negotiate with a ruthless executive who owed him absolutely nothing. By noon that same day, the financial reality hit the Silver Creek Ranch like a massive freight train. Derek sat entirely alone in his sprawling mahogany office. The grand, heavy silence of the empty barns echoed through the large glass windows. He furiously typed on his laptop, his hands shaking so violently he kept hitting the wrong keys. He pulled up his complex banking dashboards. The numbers stared back at him, cold and absolute. For 4 years, Derek had lived like a king. He bought custom luxury vehicles, imported Italian furniture, and tailored wool suits. He threw lavish, catered parties to impress real estate moguls and local politicians, but he had secretly financed that glittering lifestyle through staggering multi-million-dollar bank loans. The collateral for those massive loans was never just the physical dirt. It was the projected revenue of the elite breeding program, the 6-figure yearling sales, the exclusive stud fees. Without the horses, the ranch generated exactly $0. The phone on his desk rang loudly. It wasn't Elena. It was the senior vice president of the Regional Agricultural Bank. Derek stared at the flashing caller ID. A thick drop of cold sweat slid all the way down his spine. He picked up the receiver, his throat completely dry. "Derek," the banker said, his voice entirely stripped of its usual friendly warmth. "We just received a formal notice of asset transfer from Iron Lineage Holdings. They removed the entire purebred herd from the property at dawn. Tell me this is a temporary logistical error." "It is," Derek stammered, rubbing his pale, clammy face. "It is just a legal misunderstanding. I am fixing it right now." "There is nothing to fix, Derek," the banker interrupted sharply. "We underwrote your latest expansion loans based purely on your projected auction revenue. You just lost your only income-generating asset. You are heavily over-leveraged on a piece of dead dirt. We are freezing your credit lines effective immediately." The line went dead. Derek dropped the phone. The walls of his magnificent empire were rapidly caving in, but he still had one lifeline left: the resort deal. Vanguard Estate Holdings was paying $50 million for the lower acreage. That money would wipe out his crippling debt. It would save him. He grabbed his heavy coat and rushed out the door. He drove his luxury SUV recklessly down the winding mountain roads, pushing the engine to its absolute limit. He drove straight to the gleaming glass skyscraper of Vanguard Estate Holdings in the city center. He bypassed the front desk and walked directly into the executive suites. Victoria sat behind a massive glass desk, looking over a thick stack of legal documents. She wore a sharp emerald designer blazer. Her expression was entirely unreadable. "Victoria!" Derek gasped, bursting into the room. "I know the auction was a disaster, but we can still push the zoning permits. The land is still mine. We can break ground next month." Victoria slowly put down her silver pen. She did not smile. She looked at him not as a lover, but as a deeply flawed balance sheet. "Sit down, Derek," she said, her voice completely flat. He collapsed into the leather chair opposite her desk. His breathing was heavy, ragged. "My legal team spent the entire morning reviewing the situation," Victoria said, steepling her perfectly manicured fingers. The entire brand value of the proposed resort was tied to the historic prestige of the Silver Creek horse lineage. Our high-net-worth investors wanted to stay at a functioning, world-class breeding estate, not a barren, empty field burdened by crushing bank liens. Derek stared at her, completely stunned. "But the blueprints," he whispered. "We have a deal." "We had a deal with the Emperor of the Plains," Victoria corrected him smoothly. "Or you are currently a man facing immediate foreclosure. The bank is preparing to seize your pastures to cover your personal debts. Vanguard does not buy distressed properties locked in toxic litigation. The acquisition is formally canceled." Derek felt the blood drain entirely from his face. His chest tightened painfully. He reached out across the glass desk, a desperate, pathetic gesture. "Victoria, please, you love me. We were going to build a life together. You promised me." Victoria laughed. It was a short, sharp, entirely joyless sound. "Love?" she repeated. "Derek, I loved the power you represented. I loved the prestige. You convinced my father and me that you were a master businessman, but you let a quiet farm girl legally strip you down to the bone while you were busy drinking champagne. You are a massive liability." She stood up. "We're signaling the absolute end of the meeting. Leave your security badge at the front desk," she said coldly, "and do not call my private number again." Derek stumbled backward. The heavy glass doors closed in his face with a soft, final click. He stood alone in the sterile corporate hallway. The illusion was completely shattered. He had built his entire life on the transactional power of money and status. He bought his friends with expensive dinners. He bought his mistresses with lavish promises. He bought his own self-worth with tailored suits. But bought loyalty evaporates the exact second the bank account runs dry. When the money vanished, the people vanished. The wealthy mistress he had chosen over his devoted wife did not stay to comfort him in his darkest hour. She looked at his empty hands and brutally walked away. The karmic retribution is rarely a sudden lightning strike from the heavens. It is the simple, devastating consequence of building a house entirely out of greed. The storm had finally arrived, and Derek had absolutely nowhere left to hide. Derek drove his luxury SUV back up the long gravel driveway of the Silver Creek Ranch. The sun was dipping below the jagged peaks, casting long, dark shadows across the property. For the first time in 4 years, the sprawling estate looked exactly like what it truly was, a graveyard. He parked near the main house. He didn't bother locking the doors. There was absolutely nothing left to steal. He walked slowly toward the lower barns. The wind was picking up, biting through his thin designer suit. He pulled open the heavy wooden door. The silence inside hit him like a physical blow. And there was no warm smell of animals, no soft nickering, no rhythmic stomping of heavy hooves against the pine shavings. The stalls were completely empty. The halters were gone. The feeding buckets were scrubbed clean and stacked in neat, geometric towers. He walked down the center aisle. His leather shoes clicked sharply against the concrete. He stopped in front of a large whiteboard bolted to the wall near the tack room. It was covered in Elena's precise, neat handwriting. Winter vaccination protocol. Zone B mares. Adjust alfalfa mix for yearlings. Derek stared at the black ink. He didn't know what Zone B meant. He didn't know the name of the veterinarian. He didn't know how many bales of alfalfa a yearling required. He had signed the checks, but he had absolutely no idea how this multi-million-dollar operation actually functioned, and he had never once bothered to learn. He turned around and walked back out into the freezing wind. He headed straight for the main house. He pushed open the heavy oak front door. The house was pitch black, and it was freezing. He reached for the light switch. The crystal chandelier flickered on, casting harsh, cold light over the imported Italian furniture. He shivered violently. The temperature inside was dropping rapidly. He walked into the utility hallway and stared at the complex digital thermostat on the wall. It was blinking red. System error. Check pellet hopper. Derek stared at the screen. Pellet hopper. He had seen Elena carrying heavy bags of wood pellets from the garage 100 times. He had always walked right past her, annoyed by the dirt she tracked onto the hardwood floors. He walked into the garage. He found the bags. And they weighed 40 pounds each. He dragged one across the floor, his breathing heavy, his tailored suit catching on a sharp edge and tearing. He dumped the bag near the heating unit. He opened the metal hatch. He didn't know where to pour them. He didn't know the ignition sequence. He pressed a few buttons randomly. The screen beeped loudly, then went completely dark. He kicked the metal casing. He cursed loudly into the empty room. The house remained violently cold. He walked back into the grand kitchen. The granite countertops were spotless. He opened the massive custom refrigerator. The bright light illuminated empty glass shelves. There was a half-empty bottle of sparkling water, 2 lemons, a stale box of takeout from 3 days ago. There was no roasted chicken, no mashed potatoes, no hot coffee waiting on the counter. And his stomach growled, a sharp, painful cramp. He looked at the industrial gas stove, 6 burners, a complex array of stainless steel dials. He didn't even know how to turn on the pilot light. Derek stumbled backward, leaning heavily against the kitchen island. He slid slowly down to the cold tile floor. He pulled his knees up to his chest, wrapping his arms around his tearing suit jacket to stop the violent shivering. The horrifying, crushing reality finally set in. For years, he had looked down on her. He had called her a simple farm girl. He told Victoria she was dead weight. He genuinely believed he was the absolute master of his universe, the brilliant breadwinner keeping the entire world spinning. He was wrong. The mundane, invisible labor of a dedicated wife was the actual beating heart of his entire existence. The clean laundry, and the hot meals, the perfectly managed schedules, the grueling, freezing nights in the barn. She was the massive, silent engine keeping his glamorous life from completely derailing. He was never the emperor. He was just a shiny hood ornament on a machine she built with her own 2 hands. Without her, he was completely helpless. He sat in the dark, freezing kitchen of a house he couldn't heat, on a ranch he couldn't run, facing a mountain of debt he could never repay. He was an overgrown child who had just broken his only lifeline. He buried his face in his hands. The silence of the empty house pressed down on him, heavy and absolute. He had completely destroyed her. But in the end, she didn't need to destroy him. She just had to stop carrying him. The sun dipped below the jagged horizon, painting the vast Colorado sky in streaks of brilliant gold and fiery orange. Elena stood at the sturdy wooden fence of her newly leased ranch. She wore a heavy, dark leather jacket, her hands resting comfortably on the top rail. The evening air was cold, but she didn't shiver. Across the wide, rolling pastures, 200 purebred horses grazed peacefully in the fading light. Midnight Sovereign stood at the very top of the hill, his dark coat gleaming perfectly in the sunset. They were free. And more importantly, she was free. She had built a completely new empire from the ashes of the old one. Society often teaches women that security looks like a thick gold band and a signed marriage certificate. We are conditioned to be deeply grateful for the roof over our heads and the small, casual crumbs of affection thrown our way. We are told to keep the peace, but true safety is never found in the hands of someone else. It is not a charitable gift handed down by an arrogant husband. True safety lies entirely in your own mind. It is built strictly on your ability to survive, your absolute financial independence, and your willingness to sit in the freezing dark and silently prepare for the dawn. When the cage is finally unlocked, you do not wait for permission to step outside. You simply walk out the door and you take exactly what is yours. If you believe in the quiet, unstoppable power of an independent woman, share this story. Never let anyone convince you that your silent sacrifices are completely worthless, because the person quietly sweeping the dirt floors today might just own the entire empire tomorrow.